Good morning, and welcome to your daily briefing. I'm your host, and today is Tuesday, June 17, 2026. We've got a packed show for you today: teenagers outsmarting governments, a landmark Iran deal with some serious fine print, political upheaval in Britain, Finland rethinking the nuclear age, Ukraine squeezing Crimea, and a World Cup that is already delivering drama. Let's get into it. We're going to start with the story that is generating the most conversation among parents worldwide right now, and honestly, it's a story about the gap between good intentions and stubborn reality. About 6 months ago, Australia became the first country in the world to ban children under the age of 16 from social media. Platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, and YouTube were all required to verify users' ages and kick off anyone who didn't make the cut. Parents around the globe watched closely. Researchers watched closely. Other governments watched closely. And now, 6 months in, we have a preliminary verdict, and it is not pretty. According to Australia's own regulator, the E-Safety Commission, roughly 7 in 10 parents whose children already had social media accounts before the ban say those teenagers are still on one of the 8 restricted platforms. Either they were never removed in the first place, or they managed to create new accounts after the fact. And the teenagers themselves? They're pretty cavalier about it. The workarounds are not sophisticated. One of the most cited methods, and this is genuinely hard to believe, is drawing a mustache on your face before submitting to an age verification photo scan. That's right. A drawn-on mustache. That apparently fools the system. Others simply create new accounts with fake birth dates. Others use a parent's or older sibling's account. Some kids report that their original accounts just kept working without any disruption at all. A mother named Lauren Hillier, 42 years old, summed it up bluntly. Her 13-year-old son is still on Instagram. Her 15-year-old stepdaughter is still on Snapchat. And Lauren is still playing the role of the strict parent all by herself. The kids all laugh about it, she told reporter Victoria Kim. What a joke. We haven't been taken off anything. She says she doesn't know a single person who has actually lost an account. Now, here's why that matters so much. The whole point of a nationwide ban, from the perspective of parents like Lauren, wasn't just to block individual kids. It was to change the peer dynamic. If everyone is off the platforms, the social pressure to be on them disappears. You're not the weird kid without Instagram anymore because nobody has Instagram. The law was supposed to, as one father put it, turn the whole country into an alliance. Danny Alachi, a father of 5 in Sydney who founded a group called the Heads Up Alliance for parents trying to keep their children off smartphones, put it this way: Australia's law, if it worked perfectly, should have made the whole country a coalition. But if only some kids get removed while others slip through the cracks, that critical social mass never forms. The kids who are banned just feel more left out, not less pressured. Parents are also frustrated with the tech companies themselves. Many suspect these platforms have the technological capability to enforce age verification far more rigorously, but are choosing not to. Australia's regulator has opened investigations into 5 of the 10 platforms covered by the law, specifically Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube, and says it will decide on enforcement actions soon. Under the Australian law, companies face fines of up to 49.5 million Australian dollars, roughly $35 million US dollars, for failing to adequately bar users under 16. So the question becomes, is the whole thing a failure? Not necessarily, and here is where the story gets interesting. Some parents and observers are making a distinction between the law's impact on teenagers who were already on social media, the 13 to 15-year-olds who are the focus of most of the current reporting, versus its potential long-term impact on kids who are younger and not yet on the platforms. Take the story of a 12-year-old named Ethan. His mother, Naomi Parrish, says he has been asking her multiple times a day for permission to download TikTok. He's written letters. He's made a whiteboard list of reasons he should be allowed to have it. He has decorated those letters with stickers and left them on the kitchen counter. And Naomi has held firm, citing the law. It's given me a reason he can't have it, she says. I've said to him, it's against the law, we'll get fined. She adds, with some wry humor, that parents won't actually be fined, the penalties fall on companies, not families, but she has found it useful nonetheless to let her son believe otherwise. Another parent has taken an even more creative approach. She has told her 12-year-old that if he stays off social media until his 18th birthday, she'll give him 2,000 Australian dollars, about $1,400 US dollars. She's also doing what she calls a bit of social engineering, trying to build friendships with other families who share similar values about smartphones, and steering her son toward hobbies that don't involve screens. The underlying hope is a generational one. Beck Barton, a mother of 2 boys in the western Sydney suburb of Quakers Hill, says she hears conversations among parents at soccer practice and school drop-off that feel like the beginning of a real cultural shift. If kids grow up in an environment where none of their friends have access to social media, it might stop being the norm in the way that it's the norm right now. She compared it to smoking, something that once seemed universal, even cool, that over generations became thoroughly uncool and marginal. So Australia's experiment isn't dead. It may just have its timeline wrong. The current cohort of teens are a kind of lost generation for this policy. The real test may be whether today's 11 and 12-year-olds enter their teenage years in a different world. Meanwhile, Britain and Canada have both announced plans for similar bans. Britain, notably, says it wants to go further than Australia, including blocks on live streaming and communication with strangers across gaming sites and other online services, not just social media, for anyone under 16. They're also looking at overnight curfews and limits on infinite scrolling for under 18s. Legislation is expected to be introduced by the end of this year, with a ban in place by early 2027. Australia's painful early experience is the cautionary tale everyone else is watching. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain acknowledged the obvious objection that kids will find ways around any ban, but pushed back on the idea that this means governments shouldn't try. They get around other laws too, he said, but we don't say, oh, a teenager managed to get a drink somehow, so let's not bother banning alcohol sales to children. That would be utterly ridiculous. It is a fair point, even if the comparison between age verifying a bartender and age verifying a billion-user platform isn't quite apples to apples. Malaysia, France, Spain, Austria, Greece, Denmark, and Indonesia have all announced or already begun implementing similar restrictions in the past year. This is becoming a global policy movement, and Australia's stumbling start is going to shape how the rest of them approach enforcement, especially when it comes to holding the tech platforms themselves accountable. Alright, let's turn to what may be the biggest piece of geopolitical news of the week. On Wednesday, a senior U.S. official disclosed the full text of the preliminary agreement between the United States and Iran, a 14-point memorandum of understanding that is expected to be formally signed in Switzerland this Friday. This is the document that ends the recent military conflict between the two countries, reopens the Strait of Hormuz, and sets a 60-day clock ticking for nuclear negotiations. Let's walk through what's actually in it, because the details matter enormously. The first big headline is the ceasefire. The U.S. and Iran declare what the document calls the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. That language about Lebanon is significant. It amounts to a remarkable U.S. rejection of Israeli concerns about Hezbollah, the Iran-aligned militia group based in Lebanon. Israel has already signaled it does not consider itself bound by this provision. Second, there's money, a lot of it. The U.S. has agreed with regional partners to develop a plan worth at least $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of Iran. President Trump, speaking at the Group of Seven summit in France where he confirmed the U.S. would sign the deal, insisted the United States itself would not be putting money into that reconstruction fund. He appeared to leave open the possibility that Gulf states would. He was blunt about the threat behind the deal, warning at the summit, "We're going to bomb the hell out of them if they violate the agreement." Third, on the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has agreed to use its best efforts to allow safe passage of commercial vessels, with no charge, for 60 days. After those 60 days, there is a question about whether Iran could begin imposing fees on passage, something that would be a departure from the pre-war norm of free passage, and something that analysts have flagged as a potential sticking point. Fourth, the U.S. will lift its naval blockade within 30 days, will issue waivers for Iranian oil exports immediately, and will make available billions in frozen Iranian assets, the document says $24 billion or more, upon implementation. Analysts have noted that this gives Iran significant economic relief very early in the process, before the harder nuclear negotiations are concluded, which reduces U.S. leverage going forward. Fifth, and most crucially, the nuclear program itself. Iran reaffirms that it will not develop or procure nuclear weapons, but as analysts note, this is not a new commitment. Iran made this commitment when it signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970 and again in the 2015 deal. What the document adds is that Iran will dilute its stockpile of enriched nuclear material, rather than ship it out of the country as it did under the Obama-era deal. But a huge number of issues remain to be resolved in the next 60 days, whether Iran's major nuclear facilities will be shuttered, whether enrichment will be allowed to continue, and what the new inspection regime will look like. Trump has said he wants permanent constraints on Iran's nuclear program, not the 15-year caps that were central to the 2015 deal. The 60-day timeline for resolving all of this is, according to several analysts, extremely ambitious, some would say unrealistic. The previous nuclear negotiations ran for months before and during the war without reaching a deal. A final agreement, when and if it comes, would be endorsed by a binding UN Security Council resolution. And then there is the Israeli dimension. Israel is not a party to this agreement. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been careful not to directly criticize Trump, but the mood in Israel is anything but celebratory. Channel 14, a right-wing Israeli television station closely aligned with Netanyahu's political base, has turned sharply against Trump since the ceasefire announcement. Prominent on-air personalities, who until very recently were openly enthusiastic Trump supporters, one famously wore a Trump 2024 baseball cap on election night, have been lining up to attack the deal and the president. One host called Trump a loser. Another compared Trump's negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister whose name became synonymous with appeasement in the lead-up to World War II. A third described the deal as total surrender to the Ayatollahs. The Anti-Defamation League in Israel condemns some of the language used, including an anti-Semitic slur directed at Witkoff and Kushner. Channel 14's spokesman insists the channel doesn't take orders from politicians. But Israeli media analysts have observed that these attacks on Trump may be doing Netanyahu's bidding in a way he can't do himself publicly, allowing the prime minister to avoid a direct confrontation with the American president while his allies say the unsayable on his behalf. Trump, for his part, has been increasingly blunt and even dismissive in his public comments about Netanyahu. He confirmed he called Netanyahu crazy in a recent, expletive-laden phone call, and publicly said of him, "He'll do whatever I want him to do." That level of contempt, broadcast publicly, is extraordinary in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations. The deal gets signed Friday. The next 60 days will tell us a great deal. Moving to Britain now, where a small town in the north of England is at the centre of a political drama that could reshape the entire country. Ashton-in-Makerfield, a former coal mining community in the Greater Manchester area, is holding a special parliamentary by-election tomorrow, June 18, and the eyes of British politics are firmly on it. Andy Burnham, the popular mayor of Greater Manchester, is running for a parliamentary seat there. And while he's been coy about his ultimate intentions, most observers are under no illusions. If Burnham wins, he is expected to challenge Prime Minister Keir Starmer for the leadership of the Labour Party, which would effectively hand him control of Downing Street. Starmer's Labour government has become deeply unpopular, with polling showing dissatisfaction not just with Conservative and independent voters but within Labour's own base. Many working-class voters in traditional Labour strongholds feel the current government has abandoned them. Burnham is facing a stiff challenge from Robert Kenyon, a self-employed plumber running for Reform UK, Nigel Farage's right-wing populist party. Reform had a stunning performance in recent local elections, winning more than 1,400 municipal council seats across Britain and taking 24 out of 25 local councillor seats in Makerfield itself. Kenyon came under pressure during a televised debate for past comments about women, including a social media post in which he wrote "I'm sexist." He declined to apologize, saying the comments had been taken out of context from a rugby forum 15 years ago. At the same debate, Burnham eventually admitted that yes, if he wins the seat, he will seek to challenge Starmer for the party leadership. The outcome matters well beyond this one constituency. If Burnham loses to a Reform candidate, it would be a devastating signal about the state of the Labour government. If he wins, Britain could see a change of Prime Minister without a general election, as Labour MPs choose a new leader. Now let's hop to Finland, where lawmakers voted on Wednesday to overturn a Cold War-era ban on nuclear weapons. To be clear, Finland is not becoming a nuclear state and has no plans to become one. What this change does is allow Finland to host the nuclear weapons of its NATO allies, for deterrence, for storage, or for use in a crisis. Finland joined NATO only 3 years ago, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It shares an 830-mile border with Russia, and Finnish officials have watched with growing alarm as Russian forces build up military infrastructure along that border. The measure passed 125 to 61. Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen described it as aligning Finland's legislation with that of its closest NATO allies. There has been particular interest in whether Finland might host French nuclear-armed aircraft. France's President Macron has been expanding a so-called forward nuclear deterrence scheme, and there are reports of preliminary discussions between Paris and Helsinki. Not everyone is happy about the change. Anti-nuclear advocates warn it could heighten tensions with Russia. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, had already warned in March that by placing nuclear weapons on its territory, Finland would begin to pose a threat to Russia and that Moscow would take appropriate measures. And a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute noted that the change could send a signal to Moscow that NATO is making operational plans to increase nuclear readiness. It's a profound shift for a country that spent decades carefully managing its relationship with its eastern neighbor. But Finnish officials are clear about their reasoning. In a post-Ukraine invasion world, deterrence comes first. Let's check in on the weather in Europe, which is not good. Just 2 weeks after an unusually early and severe heatwave, Western Europe is being hit by another round of scorching temperatures. Hot, dry air from North Africa has formed a heat dome over the Iberian Peninsula and is pushing toward France, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. Temperatures are expected to reach 45 degrees Celsius, that is 113 degrees Fahrenheit, by the weekend. In France, the mayor of Paris has opened the Canal Saint-Martin for swimming in response. Tour guides in the city are redesigning itineraries around shade and indoor spaces. Travelers who plan to hike in Germany this weekend are rerouting to higher altitude locations in Switzerland. The compounding factor, as always in Western Europe, is the scarcity of air conditioning. Traditional building stock and mild summer norms mean most homes, offices, and hotels simply don't have it, and even the tourist infrastructure is struggling. On to Wall Street, where there is growing chatter about what could be one of the largest corporate mergers in history. Investors, analysts, and even a top SpaceX executive have been publicly discussing the possibility of Elon Musk merging SpaceX with Tesla, his electric vehicle company. Together, the two businesses would form a conglomerate with a combined value of roughly $4 trillion. SpaceX's president and chief operating officer Gwynne Shotwell, speaking to CNBC, said combining the two companies might make Elon's life a little easier and acknowledged there were synergies between the two companies. The two firms already share executives, jointly develop multi-billion-dollar projects, and SpaceX's IPO filings explicitly acknowledge the possibility of a merger. Because Musk controls SpaceX with a special class of shares giving him over 82% of the votes, a deal would essentially be him making an offer to himself. Legal experts say challenges from disgruntled shareholders would be extremely difficult. Texas corporate law, where both companies are now domiciled, requires shareholders to hold at least 3% of a company's stock to file a lawsuit, a threshold that would require dissident investors to collectively own around $45 billion worth of Tesla shares. One law professor put it bluntly, basically, he's gotten to the point where he can do almost anything he wishes. Whether it's good for shareholders depends heavily on the terms. Tesla shareholders would need 2/3 approval for the deal, and Musk already controls about 20% of votes. Given his track record with Tesla's famously loyal investor base, which recently approved a pay package worth potentially nearly $1 trillion, the arithmetic may well work out in his favor. In Ukraine, Kyiv has launched what it is calling a logistics lockdown of Crimea. Ukraine is using its expanding drone fleet to target supply routes into the peninsula, striking fuel trucks along the main highway connecting occupied Ukraine to Crimea, hitting bridges, and going after rail connections. The results are visible. Gasoline shortages have spread across the peninsula, lines at gas stations have stretched for hours, and rationing has been introduced. Social media has filled with videos of fuel trucks on fire after drone strikes. One Russian travel blogger posted about going to Crimea expecting sightseeing, driving around the peninsula and enjoying local wine and ending up on a quest for gasoline, with one empty station after another. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces compared strikes on Russian military vehicles along the exposed highway to, and I'm quoting, shooting partridges in an open field. Traffic on the main highway has reportedly fallen by 2/3 since Ukraine began the campaign. Ukraine has now stated its goal of gaining full control of that highway within a month. This matters strategically because Crimea serves as Russia's primary logistical hub for military operations across southern Ukraine. Choking the peninsula off also carries massive symbolic weight. Crimea is one of Moscow's most prized geopolitical possessions, and showing that Russia cannot protect it shatters a carefully maintained narrative. For the first time since Russia's 2022 invasion, the summer tourist season in Crimea is genuinely in doubt. Nearly 80% of bookings in late May and early June were cancelled. In Japan, the country's Fair Trade Commission conducted raids on the offices of 6 major ice cream manufacturers on suspicion of running a price-fixing cartel. The 6 companies, Akagi Nugio, Izaki Glico, Lotte, Meiji, Morinaga Milk Industry, and Morinaga & Company, are accused of colluding to raise prices beyond what rising raw material costs would justify. The ice cream industry in Japan is enormous, valued at more than $4 billion last year. Typical ice cream bars sell for around 100 yen, about 62 cents, and price increases of just 10 yen have drawn public scrutiny. One of the companies, Akagi, had already publicly apologized on its website for raising the price of its signature Gari Garakan soda bar. The raids come at a sensitive time. Japan is grappling with inflation for the first time in decades, and public anger over rising prices has been building. A few more stories to round out the news before we get to sports. Hillary Clinton, in a new interview with The New Yorker's David Remnick at an event in Manhattan, called Joe Biden's decision to seek re-election in 2024 a, quote, terrible mistake for himself, his legacy, and for the country. Clinton argued that whoever had emerged from a competitive Democratic primary, whether that was Kamala Harris, a governor, a senator, or anyone else, would have beaten Donald Trump. She described Democrats who tried to persuade Biden to leave the race as meeting with total denial, and said Biden ultimately stepped aside only when faced with damning polling data. Biden left the race in late July 2024, endorsed Harris immediately, but left her just 3 months to build a campaign before Election Day. The interview comes during a period of renewed scrutiny of the 2024 Democratic defeat, following a Democratic National Committee autopsy report that was itself criticized as incomplete and error-filled. Good news from Norway: Crown Princess Mette-Marit has undergone a successful lung transplant at Oslo University Hospital. The 52-year-old princess was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis in 2018, a condition that causes scar tissue to build up in the lungs and makes breathing progressively more difficult. She had been placed on a transplant waiting list just 2 weeks ago, as her health deteriorated. The princess will remain in hospital for several weeks of recovery, which is standard procedure for transplant patients to monitor for complications. The news prompted an outpouring of public support in Norway, and the royal house says Crown Prince Haakon will adjust his official schedule to support her. The princess's illness disclosure also had an unexpected public health effect. More than 11,700 Norwegians registered as organ donors after the palace announced she was on the waiting list. And before sports, a travel note worth tucking away: Central Asia has become a major draw for younger travelers looking for affordable, less crowded destinations, and no country in the region has gotten more buzz than Uzbekistan. Since the country's longtime autocrat died in 2016, Uzbekistan has steadily opened up to foreign visitors, sponsoring travel influencers, easing visa requirements, and investing in tourism infrastructure. In 2025, the country welcomed a record 11.7 million international visitors. The ancient cities of Samarkand and Khiva offer stunning Islamic architecture, tilework, mausoleums, and madrasas dating back centuries. The food is getting attention too. In Khiva, bakers pull fragrant samsa pastries stuffed with meat and pumpkin from traditional tandoor ovens. The travel warning from experienced visitors: go soon, before it gets too commercial. Now to the World Cup. The Democratic Republic of Congo has made history. In their first appearance in the tournament since 1974, 52 years, Congo came away with a 1-1 draw against Portugal. Yoan Wissa scored the goal, which was not just a result for Congo in this match but literally the first World Cup goal in the nation's history. It is a remarkable moment. Portugal's Cristiano Ronaldo, still chasing the only major trophy that has eluded him, did not get the result he was hoping for. Meanwhile, Lionel Messi continued his relentless assault on World Cup history. In Argentina's 3-0 victory over Algeria, Messi scored a hat-trick. His third goal in particular is being described as a masterpiece of orchestration. With that performance, Messi has now tied the all-time World Cup scoring record at 16 goals. It is a record many thought would never be approached. He is now level with it, and Argentina remains in the tournament. England also faced Croatia today. The details from that match are still coming in, so follow the live updates for the latest. On the cultural front, AI has powered a chip boom in South Korea so intense that it has generated its own language. South Korea produces more than 60% of the world's memory chips, and demand driven by the AI boom has supercharged the stock market, with the benchmark Kospi index more than doubling in the past year. New slang and memes about the semiconductor industry are everywhere: at family dinners, in gaming lobbies, at smoke breaks. A quiz is circulating that tests your knowledge of terms like samgionics, which refers collectively to chipmakers Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, and silicon collar, which describes workers at semiconductor companies. The chip mania is transforming not just the stock market but the country's educational culture too, with new acronyms circulating about which universities and credentials are most likely to land you a job in the industry. There's a moving piece worth mentioning today on a subject that touches many people's lives. The New York Times asked readers how mental illness had influenced their feelings about whether to become a parent. Nearly 700 people wrote in. The responses reveal a profound and often agonizing tension, worrying about passing on a condition to a child, worrying about maintaining your own well-being while raising a family, and in some cases, finding that parenthood still felt like the right path despite all of those fears. 5 specific stories from readers were published, covering couples weighing anxiety and depression, a woman considering single motherhood with ADHD and a history of depression, and couples who factored conditions like bipolar disorder and OCD into decisions about who would be the biological parent. It is a subject rarely discussed openly, and the responses suggest many people are carrying these questions largely alone. A few final recommendations before we wrap up. If you're looking for something to listen to, there is a podcast called The Last 12 Weeks, produced in collaboration with the Marshall Project, which follows a team of Capitol defense attorneys trying to stop an execution that has been 3 decades in the making. It has extraordinary access to the lawyers and the case, and by all accounts it is compelling listening. On television, the critics are rounding up the best shows of the year so far. Highlights include The Comeback's long-awaited return, starring Lisa Kudrow, now tackling artificial intelligence's threat to Hollywood, Widow's Bay, a horror comedy being called the most fun new show of the year, and The Pit, a hospital drama in its 2nd season. And if you are curious about the future of kitchen design, there is a fascinating piece about the ultra-wealthy trend of hiding everything in a kitchen: the sink, the appliances, even the refrigerator, behind custom millwork, retractable countertops, and sculptural cabinetry. Some of these kitchens cost millions of dollars and are rarely cooked in. Welcome to the luxury housing market. That is your briefing for Tuesday, June 17, 2026. A lot happening in the world today, from teenagers outsmarting governments to one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements in years, from drone warfare reshaping a peninsula to a 52-year return to the World Cup stage. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a good day.